Let's get ready to rumble!
Born in West Virginia, Emanuel Stewart moved to Detroit at the age of 12 and boxed out of the Brewster Recreation Center, where the young Joe Louis had honed his craft, winning the bantamweight title in 1963. That was in the Golden Gloves, and this was the biggest achievement in Emanuel Stewart's amateur boxing career. Stewart married at an early age. He never seriously entertained the notion of turning pro and became a licensed electrician for Detroit Edison. When his younger brother, expressed an interest in following his older sibling's footsteps, Emanuel took him to the inner city gym called the Kronk Recreation Center. He shortly found himself giving pointers to other boys in the gym and signed on as a part-time boxing coach there. Even in its early days, the Kronk embodied Stewart's team concept. Boxers were thrown together irrespective of weight class. The gym was always steamy, hardcore sparring sessions, but once they stepped out of the ring, they were like members of a fraternity, blood brothers, forged in the cauldron of a shared experience only they could understand. Initially, the Kronk colors were blue and red, but when a former Kronk gym member returned on leave from the service, he brought along his red and gold Marine Corps boxing robe, which he donated to the gym. So now gold was added to the color scheme. Kronk boxers wore matching gold and red trunks, and the more accomplished members were awarded handsome letter jackets, which of course they proudly wore, both on the streets of Detroit and to the national competitions, to which they soon began to travel. Boxing in Detroit was dead, period, until I came along and started my group, records Stewart. But within a few years we started winning, and people started to pay attention to the Kronk boxing team. Thomas Hearns was born in Memphis, but like Stewart, he had moved to Detroit at an early age and was raised on Detroit's east side. Although he had the quintessential pugilist nose, it didn't come from boxing. Hearns had broken his nose in a bicycle accident when he was 9, before he had ever laced up a pair of gloves. As a result of that injury, he experienced nasal problems throughout his career, and years later would undergo surgery for a deviated septum. Tommy must have been 10 years of age and didn't weigh more than 80 pounds when he walked into the gym. He was always a skinny little kid. All through his amateur career, he was skinny. Even though he wasn't one of the best fighters in the gym straight away, he was always special. He always gave it his best effort, and he always worked hard. Back then, we were the only gym that traveled. At other gyms, a kid might get 2 or 3 fights when the city recreation tournament came around, and outside of that, they might have got 2 or 3 fights at most. But from 1969 onwards, I would always take our kids on little out-of-town trips, records Stewart. I'd load them all into my car, and we'd drive off to Columbus or Chicago for the weekend, and of course they loved it. When a kid came from a house with no father and a lot of poverty, that meant a lot. At first, out of maybe 10 kids, Tommy might have been the 6th most talented, added Stewart. Sometimes he'd lose 3 in a row, but he was always gracious and grateful. Whenever we got back, he'd make it a point to say, "Thank you, Mr. Stewart, for taking me on that trip." 2 years younger than Leonard, 4 years Hagler's junior, Hearns was a few steps behind his future rivals in his progression through the amateur ranks. Only 14 years of age at the time, he didn't accompany Stewart to the 1973 gloves and AAU tournaments, but by 1975, he had earned his berth in the National Golden Gloves. He weighed about 110 pounds, but he surprised me, said Stewart. He lost to Mike Ayala, who went on to win the bantamweight championship that year. Ayala had had 238 amateur fights. I don't even think Tommy had even 20. Stewart said, Tommy was really quiet, but he always tried hard, even when he lost. And even though he was always so thin, he only lost to the top fighters. He lost to Ayala, who won everything in 1975. Then in the AAU, in the same year, I let him go up to 126. And he lost the decision to Ronnie Shields, who also won everything at that weight. The next year, he lost in the Golden Gloves 132-pound final to Aaron Pryor. And in the AAU final, he lost to Howard Davis. Just a few months later, Davis would be named the outstanding boxer of the 1976 Olympics. which they call the Val Barker Trophy. Tommy didn't go to the Olympic trials, said Stewart. He was still a year or two behind those guys. But he did have Howard Davis hurt in the second round of their fight. Like Marvin Hagler, Hearns also had to overcome the fact that he had to come from virtual obscurity. Nobody ever outboxed Tommy, even then, insists Stewart. He was a master boxer, but you've got to remember the politics of the era in the amateur boxing system. Rollie Schwartz, who headed up the amateur program, was from Cincinnati. And of course, the Metropolitan New York organization was also very strong. It seemed like one or two of Rollie's fighters got through to the final every year, no matter what. Guys like Pryor from Cincinnati and Davis from New York would throw those little flurries to make it look good. And of course, the judges all knew these guys. They were politically well connected, but nobody knew Tommy. He was just a little skinny guy from a Detroit club, and nobody knew who he was. This was all a new experience for me too, and nobody from Michigan had any clout whatsoever, said Stewart. A couple of Tommy's fights against Pryor, for instance, were very close, but you always knew the Cincinnati guy was going to get it. Tommy had made enough of an impression that he was picked to box on a team of American amateurs sent to Europe after the '76 Olympics. It was his first taste of international competition, and he won all of his matches. Then something happened between 1976 and 1977, said Stewart. Tommy just blossomed. Up until then, like a lot of tall kids, he'd move up a weight division each year, but he'd have grown another 2 inches in height. He was getting bigger, but he was not getting any stronger. But at the end of 1976, he went up to 139, and he didn't grow taller in height for the first time. You could actually see muscles develop. He was physically much stronger than he had ever been. By early 1977, Leonard had turned pro. Dave Jacobs phoned to ask Stewart if Hearns could come down to Maryland to spar with the Olympic champion. Tommy stayed at Jacobs' house for several days, said Stewart. Dave called me up and told me Tommy and Ray had boxed at Palmer Park. He said the whole place was packed. And what was amazing is that Tommy had outboxed Ray. It was a good workout, and nobody got hit clean, but Ray had problems with Tommy. The thing is, Tommy was an amateur. I was a professional, and he was younger than I was, Leonard recalled of the episode. I never even dreamed that just a few years down the road, Tommy would become one of my biggest rivals and foremost adversaries. I still thought of him as just a young kid. Tommy's progress was evident when the national tournaments came along that spring. In the semi-final of the 1977 National Golden Gloves, Hearns faced Ronnie Shields, who had beaten him the year before. He knocked Shields out on his way to winning the Golden Gloves, and then added the AAU title by outpointing Bobby Joe Young. Bobby Joe Young would administer the first and only defeat of Aaron Pryor's professional career. The Bobby Joe Young fight came after Pryor was inactive and ravished himself on drugs in all truth, but I thought I'd say that because I'm a bit of a fanboy. In Pryor's defense, Emanuel Stewart had been grooming his stable of amateurs for nearly 7 years. Now it was time for the next step. I always knew they would turn pro eventually, and when they did, I would too, said Stewart. That was the plan all along. On the 25th of November 1977, a month after his 19th birthday, Thomas Hearns was one of 4 Kronk boxers to make their professional debuts in downtown Detroit at the Olympia. In the main event, Mickey Goodwin knocked out Willie Williams in the first round. Hearns stopped Jerome Hill in the second of their prelim. It was his first professional win, and before he was done, there would be 60 more of them.